The Second World was one of the most chaotic periods in human history. And as with any massive conflict, there's no shortage of stories, some more fantastical than others. For example, how about this one? A German U-boat commander from World War II has just been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the sinking of a ship that killed over 3,000 people. What's the catch? He's already dead. We'll get to that in a bit, but for now, let us rewind back to 1940 when France had fallen to the Nazis, and Great Britain stood alone against the seemingly unstoppable war machine. The British were desperately trying to keep their country afloat both militarily and economically, while staring down the barrel of a coming invasion. In fact, it was so bad that Winston Churchill, then the UK's Prime Minister, reportedly told an aide, "We must keep our chins up." The Germans did eventually launch their invasion through France, but they didn't land in the south where Churchill expected them to, but in the northeast near the Belgian town of Dunkirk. This meant that British soldiers who had been stationed in the south were unable to stop the Germans at all, and ended up having to make a mad dash north to try and cover the beaches. As a result, over 300,000 British troops were stranded in France. They had no way out, and if the Germans advanced even another few miles, they would be completely surrounded. At this point, it seemed like the Brits were destined to meet a similar fate to France and surrender or worse. Fortunately, thanks to a combination of fancy footwork by the British Expeditionary Force and a series of blunders by the Germans, the BEF was eventually able to withdraw from the beach in a series of ordered retreats, but not before suffering a severe blow to their morale and a huge loss in equipment, including around 88,000 rifles, 3,000 tanks, and 200,000 trucks and other vehicles. This humiliating defeat led many in Britain to believe that the country was doomed, and even Churchill began to suspect that the war might be lost. After all, the British were vastly outnumbered by the Germans, who had taken over much of Western Europe and had a strong base of support across the continent. Even if Britain managed to hold on somehow, its army was decimated. So it looked like the end of the road for Britain, right? Well, maybe, except for one thing. British propaganda. It turns out that upon hearing of the disastrous situation at Dunkirk, the British Ministry of Information put out the following statement: His Majesty's government view with satisfaction the continued success of the British Expeditionary Force in France. They desire me to add that the conduct of the BEF has been such as to evoke the admiration of the nation. Wait, what? You heard that right. The British government claimed that everything was going great at Dunkirk, even though things were actually going quite terribly. And that was on the only time they tried to pull the wool over the eyes of the public. In fact, it happened again and again, and these weren't small cover-ups either. In so many cases, the lies spread by the British government literally saved lives. In others, they cost lives. And in yet others, well, they just made everyone feel better. So do they. We're going to do our best to uncover the truth behind 4 of the biggest cover-ups of the Second World War. No. 1. The Great Escape. While the situation at Dunkirk was far from ideal, the British soon realized that they had a serious morale problem on their hands. How could they possibly hope to win the war if their soldiers were too scared to fight? Well, the answer, according to the powers that be, was simple: distract the troops from the disaster at Dunkirk, and replace those thoughts with thoughts of something much more exciting. And what could be more exciting than a daring raid into Nazi territory? Enter Operation Dynamo, a secret mission tasked with carrying out a massive propaganda stunt. On May 9th, a group of commandos snuck into a small French port called La Piverette and replaced the Nazi flag flying from the local town hall with the Union Jack. Then, they blew up 2 trains and several barges, causing thousands of francs worth of damage. This was followed by Operation Katyn, in which British paratroopers parachuted into Saint-Valery-sur-Somme in northern France and raised the Union Jack while simultaneously destroying several German vehicles. And finally, on June, the British Special Operations Team, known as No. 100 Squadron, attacked a German radio transmitter near the coast of Belgium. They disabled the tower, raised the Union Jack, and left behind a mocking note reading, "We've switched off your wireless. Follow our example and surrender." But perhaps the most audacious of these missions was Operation Mincemeat, a joint British-American effort to convince the Nazis that the Allies were planning to invade Greece instead of Italy. This involved planting false documents on the corpse of a dead American soldier, then dropping him out of a plane and hoping he landed in Nazi-controlled territory. Fortunately for everyone involved, the plan worked like a charm. The Germans picked up the body and assumed that it was authentic, leading them to believe that the Allies were planning to attack Greece. As a result, Hitler postponed his invasion of the Soviet Union by 3 whole weeks, giving the USSR more time to prepare and ultimately costing hundreds of thousands of German lives. Number 3, the real cost of victory. Another major cover-up of the Second World would have to be the activities of the British Special Operations Executive. This covert organization carried out all sorts of shady missions on behalf of the British government, from training foreign resistance fighters to sabotaging German infrastructure. But perhaps the most controversial of these operations was the mass extermination of Allied POWs captured in Japanese-held territories. See, as the Japanese began to gain ground in the Pacific, the British found themselves holding a large number of Allied POWs. And as the war dragged on, and the Japanese grew increasingly desperate, the odds of these men ever seeing freedom became slim and none. So, in order to prevent these men from being tortured and killed by the Japanese, the British government came up with a plan. If they couldn't liberate the POWs, they would simply kill them themselves. Beginning in 1943, the SOE began a systematic program of executing Allied POWs held in Japanese camps. The prisoners were given lethal injections, usually without their knowledge or consent, and their bodies were cremated or buried at sea. While this is obviously a terrible thing, it's important to remember that the British weren't doing this out of cruelty. In fact, they believed they were doing the POWs a favor. By killing the POWs, the British could ensure that they would not have to endure any more torture or hardship at the hands of the Japanese. Plus, they also believed that killing the POWs would prevent the Japanese from ever finding out about the extent of the campus atrocities. Unfortunately for the British, their plan didn't exactly go according to schedule. In 1945, the Japanese surrendered and the British were left with thousands of POWs on their hands. Suddenly, the question wasn't how to hide the POW camps, but how to hide the fact that the British had executed hundreds of their own citizens. As you can imagine, this was a pretty tricky situation, and the British government went to great lengths to cover up their crimes. They destroyed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and even killed several people to keep quiet. Eventually, the truth came out, and the British government was forced to apologize and award compensation to the families of the victims. Number 4, the final solution. But no cover-up was more shocking and disturbing than that of the Nazi Germany's final solution. As anyone who's even vaguely familiar with the history of the Second World War knows, the Nazis were big fans of genocide, but their plans to wipe out entire groups of people from the face of the earth were no small feat. It required careful planning, logistics, and a lot of really messed up people. And despite the fact that the Nazis were arguably the most powerful country in the world at the time, even they couldn't carry out their evil schemes without getting caught sometimes. One of the most infamous cases of Nazi cover-up occurred in 1942 during the Wannsee Conference. During this meeting, high-ranking Nazi officials met to discuss the logistics of exterminating European Jewry. While the conference itself was relatively uneventful, what happened afterwards was anything but. The Nazi leadership was furious that the meeting had been leaked to the press, and they wasted no time trying to cover up the truth. They arrested several people on false charges, destroyed evidence, and even went so far as to stage a fake trial, despite their best efforts. However, the truth eventually came out, and the world learned about the horrifying plans of the Nazi regime. And speaking of horrible dictators, let's talk about this recently convicted U-boat commander. In 1942, the U-boat in question sank a ship that was carrying over 3,000 people from Portugal to Brazil. Most of the passengers and crew were able to escape on life rafts, but over 2,500 of them drowned. The captain was eventually caught and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he escaped before serving his full sentence. He was finally recaptured in 2005 and sentenced to serve the remainder of his prison term. But as of this writing, the now 86-year-old man is already dead. Still, justice was served, right? Maybe not if you ask the family members of the victims who are still waiting for closure. Now, if you want to learn more about some of the most messed up cover-ups of all time, check out crazy cover-ups that actually worked, or watch this video instead.